The frozen night and the ghost of the past. The December wind sliced through the streets of Manhattan, its icy fingers clawing through the concrete canyons and rattling the glass windows of towering skyscrapers. The city, usually so alive with the pulse of ambition, now felt eerily quiet under the weight of a pending snowstorm. Pedestrians scurried along the sidewalks, scarves pulled tight, faces down, desperate to escape the cold. Elliot Harrington stepped out of his building's marble lobby, adjusting the tailored lapels of his cashmere overcoat. His shoes, polished to a mirror sheen, clicked against the frosted sidewalk. A man at the top of the world, chairman of Harrington Global, owner of properties from Tokyo to London, and self-made billionaire before 45. Yet tonight, the cold gnawed at him in a way no material wealth could guard against. Mr. Harrington, the car's ready. Daniel, his ever-efficient chauffeur, stood beside the idling Bentley, the car's exhaust curling into the night air like a whisper of warmth. The vehicle, sleek and black, promised sanctuary from the brutal cold. But something caught Elliot's eye before he could climb inside. A shape, curled up on the bench near the entrance, small, barely more than a shadow beneath layers of mismatched clothes. A girl, arms wrapped around her knees, chin buried into her chest, trembling so violently the bench itself seemed to vibrate with her. Her hair, dark and tangled, hung in a curtain over her face, obscuring her features. He could have ignored her, could have stepped into his luxury cocoon and let the city swallow her whole, just another nameless soul lost to Manhattan's indifference. But something primal and inexplicable, froze him in place. A flash of white paper peeked from her trembling fingers, clutched so tightly her knuckles had turned bone white. A photograph, its edges frayed and corners curling with age. When the wind shifted, the paper fluttered just enough for Elliot to see. His heart stuttered. It was a photo of him. The gala. 22 years ago. He stood in a tailored tuxedo, his arm slung around a woman with cascading auburn hair and laughing amber eyes. Isabella Parker. The memory hit him like a punch to the chest. The way her laugh had bubbled out of her, unrestrained and reckless. The way her fingers had traced patterns on his wrist as they sipped champagne and whispered dreams they both knew would never happen. They had been flames to each other, bright, fleeting, and destined to burn out. He hadn't seen her in decades. "Where did you get that photo?" The words left him harsh and clipped, sharper than he intended, cutting through the silence of the street. The girl flinched, her fingers tightening around the photo as if it were a lifeline. When her face lifted, Elliot's breath caught in his throat. Her eyes were unmistakable. Isabella's eyes, amber and deep, though now clouded with exhaustion and fear. "She's my mother," the girl whispered, her voice raw from cold and disuse. The world tilted. Elliot's finely tuned mind, the one that had brokered billion-dollar deals and crushed competitors with calculated efficiency, faltered. He staggered back a step, the steady foundation of his life crumbling beneath him. Mother, Isabella, daughter. The pieces snapped together, cruel and relentless. He hadn't known, couldn't have known. Isabella had vanished, leaving only a brief apologetic note explaining it was better this way. That had been the last time he'd seen her, and he had assumed her disappearance was by choice. Now, standing before him, was living proof that his assumptions had been lies. The girl shivered, her lips taking on a dangerous shade of blue. Elliot shook off his coat and knelt, ignoring the bite of cold against his expensive trousers. He wrapped the coat around her small frame, but she weakly tried to push it off. "I don't need help," she muttered through chattering teeth. "You need warmth," he said firmly, using the same voice that had closed boardroom deals across continents. "And you're coming with me. No arguments. I don't go with strangers." His jaw clenched. "I'm not a stranger," he said softly. "You just told me. I'm your father." The girl's eyes fluttered shut, her body too exhausted to keep fighting. She slumped against him, her frame frighteningly light, all sharp bones and hunger. Without hesitation, Elliot lifted her into his arms, cradling her like something fragile and precious. Daniel opened the car door without needing a command. The Bentley's interior was warm, but the girl's shivering didn't stop. She curled into herself, instinctively seeking heat, her fingers still clenched around the photograph. The car slipped into the Manhattan night, headlights carving a path through the snow-dusted streets. Elliot couldn't stop staring at her face, searching for Isabella in every curve and angle. She was there, in the slope of her nose, the arch of her brows, the stubborn set of her jaw. But there was something else, something that had nothing to do with Isabella. Fear. She didn't trust him. Why would she? He was a stranger who had lived in a palace while she had slept on benches. The enormity of it settled on his chest like a weight, pressing the air from his lungs. His daughter, his flesh and blood, had been out here alone, a ghost in his own city. As they pulled into the private garage beneath his building, Elliot carried her out of the car, his grip firm but gentle. Daniel held the elevator door, and together they ascended to the top floor. The penthouse was silent, its luxury almost obscene in contrast to the girl's worn clothes and battered sneakers. Crystal chandeliers, Italian marble floors, and modern art, each detail designed to impress guests, none of it suited for her. He laid her on the pristine leather sofa, his coat still wrapped around her small frame. She stirred slightly, mumbling something unintelligible. Elliot crossed to the kitchen, grabbing a bottle of water and a clean towel. When he returned, her eyes were open, barely, but her gaze was sharp despite her exhaustion. "Why?" she rasped. "Why help me now?" "Because I failed you." The words caught in his throat. Instead, he offered her the water, his fingers brushing hers. "Because you're my daughter." Her laughter was bitter and weak, but it was laughter nonetheless. Too late. The weight of her words settled like lead in his chest. Too late. 2 decades lost. 2 decades she had needed him. But he wasn't a man who surrendered easily, not in business, and not now. "I know I can't change the past," he said quietly, "but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." The girl's eyes flickered with something. Hope, maybe, though she quickly buried it beneath layers of hard-earned distrust. "You'll get bored," she said softly. "Rich people always do." "Not with you," Elliot said. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken things. Finally, the girl's eyes slid shut again, her breathing softening into the steady rhythm of sleep. Elliot stood watch, the past clawing at the edges of his mind. But the future, the fragile, uncertain future, holding his attention like nothing ever had before. Somewhere in the city, the snow began to fall in earnest, covering the sidewalks and benches in a soft white shroud. But in the penthouse, the warmth began to creep in, slow and tentative, like the first fragile buds of spring. Elliot settled into the armchair beside the couch, prepared to watch over her through the night. She might not trust him yet, but that was okay. He was ready to earn it. Cracks in the glass and ghosts at the door. The scent of fresh linen filled the air as the early morning sun poured through the towering windows of Elliot's penthouse. The city's distant hum pressed faintly against the glass, muffled by the altitude and the silence that filled the rooms. The girl, his daughter, still slept on the sofa, the fine leather wrinkled beneath her thin frame. Elliot stood a few steps away, coffee cup in hand, watching her. His usual morning routine. News briefs, economic reports, a series of calls to Tokyo and London, sat untouched on his tablet. None of it seemed important now. She was so much smaller than he expected. In his mind, when he'd imagined the daughter he never knew, she'd been polished, bright-eyed, perhaps home from a good university. Maybe she'd have a professional job, an ambition that mirrored his own. Instead, she was a shadow, skeletal fingers clutching his expensive coat, bruises hiding beneath threadbare sleeves. It struck him, again and again, how close he had come to never finding her. And she hated him for it. He could see it in the rigid way she curled into herself even in sleep, like someone used to waking up in fear. Her body was too still, the kind of stillness born from learning how to avoid notice. Survival had carved itself into her bones. Elliot's fingers curled tightly around the coffee cup, the heat burning into his skin, a welcome sensation, because it reminded him this was real. His daughter, his blood, flesh and bone that carried half of him. He wasn't prepared for the sound of her stirring, the soft groan as she shifted, squinting against the sunlight. Her eyes fluttered open, amber like her mother's, but guarded, darker somehow. The split-second vulnerability vanished the moment she realized where she was. Her back shot straight, her hand clutching at the coat like it was armor. "Where am I?" Her voice was hoarse, her throat raw from exposure and dehydration. "My home," Elliot said softly. "You passed out last night. I brought you here." Her gaze darted around the penthouse, taking in the ridiculous luxury, the velvet drapes, the gleaming floors, the priceless artwork casually hanging on the walls. Her lip curled slightly, a flicker of disgust passing over her face. "Figures," she muttered. "Some kind of trophy rescue. Bet it'll make a great press release." Elliot's jaw tightened, though he tried not to show it. "No press," he said firmly. "No one knows you're here." Her shoulders sagged slightly, though whether it was relief or disappointment, he couldn't tell. "How do I know you're not lying?" "You don't," Elliot said honestly, "but you'll have to decide whether you're going to run or trust me." Her fingers played with the frayed cuff of her hoodie, a nervous habit that immediately struck him as familiar. Isabella used to do the same thing with napkin corners at restaurants when they argued. "What's your name?" he asked gently. She gave him a wary glance, as though the question itself might be a trap. "Lily," she said after a pause. "Lily Parker." The name settled into the air between them, a delicate thread connecting them across the years. "Lily," Elliot repeated, tasting the unfamiliar shape of it in his mouth. "That's a beautiful name." "Don't," she snapped, her voice suddenly sharp. "Don't do that. Pretend you care." He exhaled slowly. "I'm not pretending." Her laugh was brittle. "Where were you when my mom died? When I got bounced from foster home to foster home? When I slept on buses and park benches and stole food because no one gave a damn?" Elliot absorbed every word like a blow, each one digging deeper into the shame he was already drowning in. "I didn't know about you," he said quietly. "If I had." "You'd what?" she demanded. "Showed up in a limo, bought me a pony and called it a day." He didn't answer right away. There was no point. No words could erase 21 years of absence. No explanations would soothe the raw ache he saw in her eyes. Instead, he said, "Are you hungry?" Lily blinked, startled by the abrupt change. "What?" "Breakfast," he said, already heading toward the kitchen. "You look like you haven't had a decent meal in a long time." She hesitated. The offer dangled between them, fragile as glass, but hunger eventually overcame pride. She stood, his coat hanging off her like a cape, and followed him, keeping several feet of distance between them, as though proximity might make her trust him by accident. The kitchen was absurd. Granite countertops, state-of-the-art appliances, a refrigerator stocked with items he never touched himself. He'd always left that part of his life to his staff. But today, there was no staff. It was just them. Elliot rolled up his sleeves, revealing strong forearms and a luxury watch that cost more than most people made in a year. "Scrambled eggs, okay?" Lily folded her arms, leaning against the wall. "Can you even cook?" He gave her a small, self-deprecating smile. "I guess we'll find out." She didn't smile back, but her posture relaxed a fraction. She watched as he fumbled with the pan, nearly burning the butter, cracking eggs awkwardly, and dropping a piece of shell into the mixture. Despite herself, her lips twitched. "You're hopeless," she muttered, moving past him and taking over. "I used to cook for my foster brothers all the time." Elliot stepped back, watching her work with practiced efficiency. There was something heartbreaking about how comfortable she was in a kitchen far too nice for someone used to making do with nothing. They ate in silence, side by side at the long marble island. The food was simple, but it tasted better than any meal Elliot could remember. Not because of the eggs, but because Lily was there, the first meal they'd ever shared. "So," he said after a while, "tell me about Isabella." Lily's fork froze halfway to her mouth. The familiar guarded expression settled over her face, but after a long pause, she answered. "She was everything," Lily said softly. "She sang to me when I was scared. Told me stories about this great man she used to know. My father." Her lips twisted. "She made you sound like a superhero." Elliot swallowed past the lump in his throat. "She never told me she was pregnant." "I figured." Lily's voice was flat. "She always said you were better off not knowing." The weight of those words settled heavily between them. "I wasn't better off," Elliot said quietly. "Neither were you." The admission seemed to catch her off guard. Her gaze flicked to him, uncertainty in her eyes. She didn't trust him. Not yet. But maybe, just maybe, she wanted to. Before either of them could speak again, the penthouse intercom buzzed. Elliot frowned. "I wasn't expecting anyone." Lily stiffened immediately, her body shrinking into itself. "I should go," she said quickly. "I can't be here if—" "Stay." His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. "I'll handle it." He crossed the marble floor and pressed the intercom button. A woman's voice crackled through the speaker, sharp and clipped. "Elliot, it's me. Open the door." Lily tensed at the sound, instinctively recognizing authority and danger even without knowing the source. Elliot's fingers hovered over the button, hesitation flickering across his face. Then, with a resigned sigh, he pressed it. The elevator doors slid open moments later, revealing Victoria Harrington, Elliot's sister. Her perfectly tailored suit clung to her tall frame, her red lipstick immaculate despite the early hour. Her eyes swept across the penthouse before landing on Lily, narrowing slightly. "Charming," she said coldly. "Care to explain why there's a stray in your penthouse, Elliot?" Lily stood frozen, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup, every instinct screaming at her to run. Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes, and the way she looked at Lily made her feel less like a person and more like an inconvenience. "Victoria," Elliot said, his voice low with warning. "She's not a stray." "Oh." Victoria arched a perfectly sculpted brow. "Then who is she?" Elliot stepped between them, his broad frame blocking Victoria's line of sight. "She's my daughter." The silence that followed was a vacuum, sucking all the air from the room. Lily's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know what terrified her more, the weight of that word hanging between them, or the look in Victoria's eyes. It wasn't shock, it was calculation. Knives behind smiles and fragile bridges. Victoria Harrington stood in the entrance of the penthouse, her stiletto heels clicking against the marble floor with a precision that matched her personality. Cold, calculated, and meant to make anyone in her path feel small. She radiated the effortless power of someone born to wealth, her sleek black suit cutting sharp angles against her slender frame, her expression carved from stone. Lily had encountered people like her before, foster mothers with smiles that never touched their eyes, social workers who spoke in rehearsed empathy, landlords who slammed doors in her face when she couldn't scrape together rent. She could smell the danger radiating from Victoria like perfume. Elliot stepped fully in front of Lily, his broad shoulders blocking Victoria's view. Protective. Lily hadn't had that before. The unfamiliarity of it made her both wary and longing. "She's my daughter," Elliot said again, his voice firmer now, like he was staking a claim not just for Victoria, but for himself. Victoria's smile was slow, her lips curving with the grace of a snake preparing to strike. "Your daughter," she repeated, tasting the words like she was deciding whether to spit them out or savor them. "How unexpected." Lily's pulse pounded in her ears. The room felt too big, too bright, too exposed. She was used to blending into shadows, not standing center stage in a gilded tower. Victoria stepped forward, her heels whispering against the marble. "Where's the mother, then?" Her tone was soft, but there was a blade beneath it. Elliot's jaw clenched. Isabella passed away when Lily was young. Tragic. Victoria's eyes never left Lily's face. And you've been where all this time, sweetheart? Lily's fists curled at her sides. None of your business. Oh, Victoria's smile widened, the condescension sharpening the edges. But it is. Everything involving this family's reputation is my business. Lily opened her mouth, probably to hurl something sharp back. But Elliot cut in, voice low and commanding. Victoria, you're overstepping. Am I? Victoria didn't back down. The board will have questions, Elliot. A secret heir, one who conveniently shows up with nothing to her name but a sob story. This isn't some fairy tale reunion. It's a liability. Lily's face burned with anger, but under it was something colder. Fear. She was used to people leaving, pushing her out, closing doors. Even when they took her in, it was always temporary. No one ever fought for her. But before she could react, Elliot's voice cut through the tension like steel. She's my daughter. Not a press release, not a scandal. If the board has a problem with that, they can come to me directly. Victoria's brows lifted slightly, a rare sign of surprise. Interesting. Her eyes flicked to Lily once more, cold and assessing. Well, let's hope this street charity project doesn't cost you more than a few PR points. With that, Victoria turned on her heel, her departure just as sharp as her arrival, leaving a trail of expensive perfume and thinly veiled threats in her wake. The silence she left behind was deafening. Lily stood rigid, her nails digging into her palms. I'm not staying here, she muttered. You're not leaving, Elliot said, his voice quiet but unwavering. Not because of her. You think I care about her. Lily snapped. I'm not stupid. I know how this works. You feel guilty, you keep me around for a few weeks, and when it gets inconvenient, you'll cut me loose. Elliot's expression softened, not with pity, but with something gentler. Understanding. You have every right not to trust me, he said, but I'm asking you to give me a chance to prove you wrong. Lily wanted to argue, wanted to say no, but the exhaustion of too many cold nights and too much hunger dragged at her bones. Against her better judgment, she stayed. The weight of normal. The next few days were a strange dance. Elliot, who was used to commanding rooms and negotiating multi-billion-dollar contracts, suddenly found himself unsure of how to speak to his own daughter. He brought her clothes, expensive but simple, soft fabrics and muted colors, and she wore them reluctantly, as if they might burn her skin. He filled the fridge with food, only to find her sneaking packets of crackers into her room at night, her survival instincts still ruling her reflexes. She avoided the staff, moving through the penthouse like a ghost, finding hiding spots no one had ever noticed. Under the grand staircase, behind the heavy velvet curtains in the reading nook, on the balcony where the city lights felt close enough to touch. Elliot tried not to hover, but it was impossible not to watch her, not to see all the cracks life had carved into her. The way she flinched at loud noises, the way her eyes darted to exits in every room, the way she ate, too fast, always leaving something on the plate, like she wasn't sure if it would be her last meal. They spoke, but only in fragments. Do you need anything? No. Do you want to go out? No. Are you comfortable here? Define comfortable. It was a fragile existence, held together by politeness and fear, but Elliot was patient. He built his fortune brick by brick. He could do the same with his daughter, even if it took years. Shadows from the past. The first real fracture came one afternoon when Elliot returned from a meeting to find Lily standing in his office. She wasn't snooping, not exactly, but her fingers hovered over a framed photograph on his desk, a picture of Elliot and Victoria, taken at a charity gala 5 years ago. She looks like she's never smiled a day in her life, Lily muttered. Elliot set his briefcase down. Victoria isn't the easiest person to love. Or trust, Lily added. He stepped closer, but not too close. She's protective of the company. It's all she's ever cared about. Lily turned, arms crossed, her eyes flashing. She's not just protective. She's a shark, and she's looking at me like I'm something she needs to get rid of. She won't touch you, Elliot said, the quiet steel in his voice unmistakable. You can't promise that. I can. Lily's gaze searched his face for the lie, but she found none. The certainty in his eyes startled her. No one had ever promised to stand between her and danger before. She'll come for me, Lily said softly. People like her always do. Elliot's expression didn't change, but his hands curled into fists at his sides. Then let her try. The warning. The warning came 2 days later, subtle, but unmistakable. A man appeared near the lobby entrance as Lily stepped out for some air. He was tall, with a lean, hungry look, his eyes too bright, his smile too smooth. He didn't speak to her, just stood there, watching. Lily knew a threat when she saw one. She'd grown up reading intentions like street signs, who was safe, who wasn't, who would hurt you if you let your guard down. This man radiated danger. She backed away, slipping into the safety of the building, but her hands shook for hours afterward. That night, as Elliot worked late in his office, Lily appeared in the doorway. She didn't come all the way in, just hovered at the threshold like a stray unsure if it was really welcome inside. There was a guy watching me today, she said quietly. Elliot looked up immediately. Where? Outside. Just standing there. Did he say anything? No. Elliot's jaw tightened. You did the right thing coming to me. The trust it had taken for her to tell him that wasn't lost on him. It was fragile, a hairline crack of vulnerability, and he knew one wrong move could shatter it completely. We'll increase security, Elliot said. And if Victoria's behind this, I'll handle her. Lily hesitated, then asked, Why do you care so much? Elliot stood, walking to the door, standing just close enough to her that their shadows almost touched. Because you're mine, he said softly. And I'm not letting anyone take you away from me. Lily didn't respond, but for the first time, she didn't pull away either. The bridge between them was still cracked, but maybe, just maybe, they were starting to build something stronger. Unfinished scars and unwritten futures. The mid-morning sun painted golden stripes across the marble floor of the penthouse, but the warmth never reached Lily's skin. She sat curled on the overstuffed leather couch, legs tucked beneath her, wearing the soft gray hoodie Elliot had bought for her. It was too clean, too new, and it felt like a costume every time she pulled it on. The television flickered in the background, but she wasn't watching. Her fingers toyed with the hem of her sleeve, twisting it into knots, an old habit from a dozen foster homes, where silence was safety and small movements kept her sane. Elliot sat across the room, his laptop open on the sleek glass coffee table, but his eyes weren't on the screen. They were on her, watching with a careful kind of patience, the kind that made her nervous. She didn't know what to do with that kind of attention. Most people watched her to see if she'd steal something, run off, or cause trouble. But he was just there. She hated it, and part of her needed it. You don't have to sit here, she muttered, not looking up. I'm not going to break your fancy stuff. Elliot closed the laptop. I'm not worried about that. Then why are you hovering? Her voice was sharper than she meant, like a reflex. Because I want to know you, Elliot said. And I'm not going to pretend I know how to do this. Lily's fingers stilled on her sleeve. That was the thing about him. He didn't dress up his words in fake sympathy or slick speeches. He was blunt, sometimes awkwardly so, but always direct. Why now? She asked, her voice smaller. Why do you suddenly want a daughter when you've been fine without one? He didn't answer right away. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it. Because I didn't know you were out there, Elliot said. And if I had, nothing would have stopped me from finding you. Sounds nice, Lily said, her walls climbing back up. But it's easy to say that now. I know, he admitted, but it's the truth. The words sat between them, fragile and uncertain. Lily couldn't believe them. Not yet. But she didn't get up and leave the room either. That was something. Echoes of the past. Later that afternoon, Elliot found her standing at the window, her forehead resting against the glass, breath fogging the surface. Below, Manhattan roared with life. Cars honking, people rushing, the never-ending pulse of a city that didn't care who you were. She used to walk those streets with her head down, blending into the background. Now she was up here, so far removed from it that it felt like a dream she might wake up from at any moment. "It doesn't feel real," she said without turning. "What doesn't?" "This." Her hand gestured at the penthouse, the city, all of it. "All of this feels borrowed." Elliot stepped beside her, keeping a careful distance. "It's not borrowed. You belong here." Her laugh was hollow. "I'm not one of you." "One of who?" "Rich people." Her lip curled slightly. "People who never wondered where their next meal was coming from." Elliot's gaze shifted to the street below. "I didn't grow up with money." That caught her attention. She turned her head slightly. "Bullshit." "It's true," Elliot said. "I grew up in a 2-bedroom walk-up in Queens. My mom worked 2 jobs and still came home late to cook dinner." Lily's brow furrowed. "Then how did you end up?" "This?" Her hand gestured to the sprawling penthouse. "I worked," Elliot said simply. "I wasn't the smartest kid, but I was stubborn. I flipped my first property at 20 and just kept going." Lily searched his face, trying to reconcile the man in front of her, polished, powerful, with the story he'd just told. It didn't fit, and yet there was something in the way he said it, the quiet pride and exhaustion layered together, that felt real. "Why didn't you ever look for her?" Lily asked suddenly. "My mom." Elliot's jaw tightened, regret flickering in his eyes. "I did. After she disappeared, I hired private investigators, called hospitals, even checked shelters. It was like she vanished into thin air." Lily wanted to believe him, wanted to believe her mother hadn't been just another disposable girlfriend in a long string of them. But hope was dangerous, and she was too tired to hold it for long. "She always said you were a good man," Lily whispered, almost to herself. Elliot's throat tightened. "I wasn't good enough." Victoria's game. It was late when the first blow landed. Not a punch, something quieter, sharper. The news broke at 10:07 p.m. Billionaire's long-lost daughter, homeless con artist or heir apparent. Lily sat frozen on the couch, the headline blazing across the television screen. Grainy photos of her, taken from the street, flashed in sequence, her huddled on benches, digging through a trash can once, her face hollowed out by hunger. Each image was a knife. I didn't tell anyone," Lily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I swear." Elliot stood, his face unreadable, but his hands curled into fists. "I know." "Then how?" "Victoria," he said, the single word cutting through the room like a razor. Lily's stomach knotted. "Why would she do this?" "Because she sees you as a threat." Elliot's voice was cold, controlled. "She's protecting what she thinks is hers." The old familiar shame settled in Lily's chest, the feeling of being unwanted, too much trouble, disposable. "I should go," she said quietly, standing. "No." Elliot's voice snapped like a whip. "You're not running." "This isn't my world," Lily said, her voice breaking. "I can't fight people like her." "You're not fighting alone." Her breath caught. No one had ever said that to her before. The ghost of foster homes passed. The next day, the first letter arrived. No return address, but Lily knew the handwriting instantly. Jagged, slanted, the letters pressing into the paper too hard. Marcus, her last foster father. "You think you're safe up there with your rich daddy. You'll always be gutter trash. People like you never stay clean." She crumpled the paper, her hands shaking. Elliot found her in the kitchen, her back to the counter, the letter in her fist. "Who sent it?" he asked quietly. "No one." Her voice was brittle. Lily. Her defenses cracked, just a little. Someone from before. It doesn't matter. It matters, Elliot said. If someone's threatening you, I need to know. The fear in her eyes was sharp, too raw to hide. You can't fix this, she whispered. You can't protect me from ghosts. He stepped closer. Try me. Bridges and bargains. That night, they stood side by side on the balcony, the city stretching out before them in a sea of glittering lights. Lily leaned against the railing, the cold air biting her skin, but she didn't move away. Why are you trying so hard? She asked, her voice lost in the wind. Because you're my daughter, Elliot said simply. That's not a reason. It's the only one that matters. She turned toward him, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. What if I'm not worth it? Elliot's heart cracked right down the middle. You are. They stood there, the distance between them shrinking inch by inch, two broken people trying to figure out if love could be built on shattered foundations. Lily didn't reach for his hand, but she didn't pull away when he rested his palm on her shoulder, a silent promise. She didn't trust him yet, but for the first time, she wanted to try. The weight of blood and the grip of fear. Lily lay awake in the oversized bed, tangled in sheets that felt too soft for her skin. The silence in Elliot's penthouse was unnerving. It wasn't like the shelters, where low murmurs, creaking cots, and distant coughs filled the nights. Here, silence had weight. It pressed down on her, making her chest tight, filling her mind with memories she couldn't outrun. She stared at the ceiling, the faint hum of the city filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was surreal, being here, in this expensive shell, when just weeks ago her bed had been a patch of concrete behind a hardware store. She hadn't told Elliot about that place, about the regulars, the man with the limp who always shared his blanket, the woman who talked to her hands, the teenage boy who never spoke but carved faces into brick with a pocket knife. They had been her world. And now she was in his world, where everything was polished, expensive, and so far above her that it might as well be a dream. But it wasn't. The phone buzzed on the nightstand, vibrating against the wood. Unknown number. Her stomach twisted. She already knew who it was. She answered without speaking. I see you. The voice crooned, smooth as oil and twice as slick. Lily's fingers gripped the phone so tightly her knuckles went white. What do you want? She whispered. You left, but you didn't leave, Marcus said, his voice sending ice down her spine. Little street girl all dressed up in silk. Doesn't suit you. Leave me alone, she hissed. His laugh slithered through the speaker. You know how easy it is to make someone disappear in a city this big. Her breath caught in her throat. She hung up, chest heaving, hands trembling. The old terror curled in her stomach, the certainty that she could never outrun her past. She stuffed the phone under the pillow, but the fear stayed, seeping into her skin like poison. The thin thread of trust. The next morning, Elliot found her in the kitchen, already dressed, clutching a mug of coffee like a lifeline. Her face was pale, the dark circles under her eyes more pronounced than usual. You didn't sleep, he said, more observation than question. She didn't look at him. Never do. Elliot poured himself coffee, moving slower than usual, trying not to scare her off. He'd learned her moods, when to approach, when to back off, when to let the silence be enough. But today, the silence felt heavier. Someone called me, Lily said suddenly. Her fingers tightened around the mug, the knuckles turning white. Someone from before. Elliot stilled. Who? She shook her head. It doesn't matter. They're just reminding me that I don't belong here. He set his cup down, leaning against the counter. That's not true. She finally looked at him, her expression somewhere between disbelief and frustration. You keep saying that, like it's a magic spell that's going to erase everything. I know it won't. His voice was steady, but I'm going to keep saying it until you believe it. Lily snorted softly, but it lacked venom. There was something close to gratitude flickering in her eyes, though she hit it well. You can't protect me from ghosts, Elliot. I can try. She didn't answer, but the fact that she stayed, that was enough for now. Victoria's second strike. That afternoon, the elevator chimed, and Lily's stomach immediately clenched. She already knew who it would be before the doors opened. Victoria. She glided into the penthouse like she owned it, her tailored suit pristine, her hair swept into an elegant knot, her smile razor-sharp. Lily stood behind the kitchen island, her fingers curling around the countertop edge like it could anchor her. "Still here," Victoria said, her tone light but dripping with disdain. How adorable. Elliot stepped into the room, his presence filling the space immediately. "You're not welcome here, Victoria." "Oh, relax." Victoria waved a manicured hand. "I'm here for business." "You mean sabotage," Elliot said coldly. Victoria's smile widened. "Call it what you want." She turned her gaze to Lily, eyes sweeping over her like she was inspecting a stain on her designer carpet. "You've made quite the impression in the press. The tragic street urchin, rescued by her long-lost billionaire father. It's all very Lifetime movie." Lily's jaw clenched, but she stayed silent. "But you and I both know," Victoria continued, her voice softening into something poisonous, "that fairy tales don't last. Sooner or later, you'll trip over your own lies." "I'm not lying," Lily said, her voice surprisingly steady. Victoria's brow lifted. "Aren't you? I wonder how many things you've stolen, how many scams you've run, how many stories you've spun to survive." Elliot took a step forward. "That's enough." But Lily's face burned, shame crawling up her neck. Victoria's words were too close to the truth. She had stolen. She had lied. She had done things she wasn't proud of to survive. Victoria's smile was almost kind. "It's okay, dear. It's not your fault. Trash can't help being trash." That broke something. Lily's coffee cup hit the floor, shattering into pieces. Without a word, she turned and fled down the hall, the slam of her bedroom door echoing through the penthouse. Elliot's fists clenched. "Get out." Victoria's smile never wavered. "Don't say I didn't warn you." The edge of running. Lily sat on the floor of the guest bedroom, knees pulled to her chest, shaking hands tangled in her hair. Her heartbeat roared in her ears, drowning out everything else. She shouldn't have stayed. She should have run the moment she saw that first article. She knew how this ended. She was always the stray, the foster kid who didn't belong. The problem. A soft knock startled her. "It's me." Elliot's voice came through the door. "Can I come in?" She wiped at her face, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Yeah." He entered slowly, sitting on the floor across from her, his long legs stretched out, his suit slightly wrinkled. "Victoria doesn't define you," he said gently. "She's right, though," Lily whispered. "I'm not like you." "No, you're not," Elliot said, and for a terrifying second, she thought he was agreeing with Victoria. But then he added, "You're stronger." Lily blinked. "What?" "You survived things Victoria couldn't imagine." Elliot's voice was soft, but certain. "That's strength." Lily wanted to believe him. She really did. But all she could see was every home she'd ever been kicked out of, every door slammed in her face, every time someone had looked at her and seen nothing but trouble. "I'm scared," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. Elliot's hand rested on the floor between them, not touching hers, but close. "So am I." That startled her. I don't know how to do this," he said, gesturing between them. "I've closed billion-dollar deals. I've built entire skyscrapers. But I don't know how to be a father." Lily's fingers twitched toward his, just barely brushing. "Maybe we figure it out together." Elliot's breath caught, but he didn't move, letting her make the choice. "Okay," she said softly. "Okay." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't trust. But it was a beginning. The threat returns. That night, as Lily brushed her teeth, her phone vibrated again. Unknown number. She didn't want to answer, but she knew ignoring it wouldn't make it stop. She pressed accept. Nice place you got, Marcus purred. Bet it's real easy to break into. Lily's heart slammed against her ribs. Leave me alone, she said, but her voice cracked. Rich men get tired of strays, Marcus said. When he throws you out, you'll crawl right back, and I'll be waiting. The line went dead. Lily's toothbrush slipped from her fingers, clattering into the sink. And somewhere outside the penthouse, Marcus stood in the shadows, waiting. Bloodlines, broken chains, and the first dawn. The city sparkled below the penthouse windows, a sea of golden lights against the ink-black sky, but Lily wasn't looking at it. She stood in the dark bathroom, hands gripping the marble sink so tightly her fingers ached, her breath uneven. The phone call echoed in her ears. Rich men get tired of strays. She could still hear Marcus's voice, that oily, mocking tone that had haunted her through 4 foster homes and 2 shelter stays. He was right, wasn't he? People didn't keep girls like her. They collected them like projects and discarded them when they stopped being cute success stories. Elliot would get tired too. She stared at her own reflection, her face thinner than it should be, skin paler under the harsh bathroom lights, eyes shadowed with exhaustion. She saw the kid who slept in bus stations, the girl who hid sandwiches under her mattress in foster homes because dinner was never a guarantee. The girl who was always one mistake away from being kicked out. Her hand shook as she turned off the light and slipped into the hallway. The penthouse was too quiet, too big, and every creak of the floor felt like a scream. She needed air. She needed space. She needed to run. Lily grabbed her backpack, the same ratty thing she'd carried for years, and slipped silently toward the elevator. The doors were just sliding open when a voice stopped her cold. Going somewhere? Elliot stood at the far end of the hallway, his suit jacket draped over one arm, tie loosened. His hair was slightly out of place, like he'd run his hand through it one too many times. There was no anger in his face, no disappointment, just quiet sadness. Lily's throat tightened. I needed some air. You were leaving. It wasn't a question. Her fingers curled into the strap of her backpack, the instinct to deny rising to her tongue, but she couldn't do it. Not this time. I don't belong here, she whispered. Elliot stepped forward slowly, as if approaching a wild animal. Who told you that? No one has to tell me, she said. I've known my whole life. You're wrong, Elliot said softly. You belong here because you're my daughter. That doesn't mean anything, she said, her voice breaking. Blood doesn't mean you want me. Elliot's steps stopped, his face unreadable. You think I don't want you. She couldn't meet his eyes. Everyone leaves. He was silent for a long moment, then said, Come with me. Lily hesitated. Why? Because I need to show you something. The room she didn't know existed. Elliot led her down the hall to a door she hadn't paid much attention to. It was just one of many in the massive penthouse. He unlocked it with a small key from his pocket, and the door swung open. The room was small compared to the rest of the penthouse, barely larger than a walk-in closet. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were boxes, photos, and old letters, all worn from handling. The air smelled faintly of old paper, like a forgotten attic. Lily stepped inside cautiously, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. What is this? She asked, her voice hushed. Elliot's fingers brushed a weathered photo on the shelf. Isabella, smiling at the camera, a sunset at her back. This is everything I could find after your mom disappeared. Lily's breath caught in her throat. Every investigator's report, Elliot continued softly. Every rumor, every photo anyone sent me. I never stopped looking. Lily swallowed hard, her fingers trembling as she reached for a small stack of letters in the corner. They were postmarked from cities all over the country: Chicago, Portland, Denver, and all were unopened. "I didn't even know," she wrote, Lily whispered. "She never sent them," Elliot said. "I found them in a storage locker after she died. She was going to send them, I think, but she was scared. Scared I'd take you from her." Lily ran her fingers over the envelopes, her mother's loopy handwriting standing out starkly against the yellowed paper. Each letter was a piece of a life Lily never knew her mother had tried to protect. "She thought I'd be better off without you," Lily said softly. "She was wrong," Elliot said. "I would have moved heaven and earth to find you." Lily's hand trembled slightly as she set the letters down. Her throat felt too tight to speak. She'd spent so long convincing herself that she was unwanted, easier to believe than hoping for something else. But here, in this room, was proof that someone had always been looking. Her father. Victoria's last move. They returned to the living room just in time for the phone to ring. Elliot answered, his expression darkening almost immediately. "What's she done now?" he asked, voice clipped. Lily froze. "Victoria." Elliot listened, his face a mask of tight control, but his knuckles widened around the phone. When he hung up, he took a deep breath before turning to Lily. "She leaked your entire file to the press," he said softly. "Every foster home, every arrest, even the ones that were dropped. Everything." Lily's stomach turned to lead. "Of course she did." Elliot stepped closer. "This isn't your fault." "She's right, though," Lily said, her voice hollow. "I'm just a street kid. I don't belong here." Elliot cupped her face gently, forcing her to look at him. "You belong anywhere you choose to be. And you are not just a street kid." Lily's breath hitched. "What if I screw this up?" Elliot smiled, soft and sad. "Then we screw it up together." Marcus returns. The next day, the building's security footage caught him. Marcus, lingering just outside the entrance. He never came inside, just stood there, smoking, watching. Elliot called his security team, increasing surveillance, adding guards to the floor. Lily paced the penthouse, nerves frayed. "He's never going to stop," she said, voice cracking. "Guys like him, they wait. They wear you down." Elliot's jaw was tight, but his hand rested on her shoulder, grounding her. "He's never getting near you again." Lily shook her head. "You can't be everywhere." Elliot knelt in front of her, his hand steady on hers. "But I can fight for you, and I will." Tears welled in her eyes, the weight of years of fear cracking under the sheer force of Elliot's certainty. "No one's ever fought for me before," she whispered. "There's a first time for everything," Elliot said softly. The final confrontation. Victoria's downfall was swift and public. Elliot released the evidence, her payments to reporters, her bribes to private investigators to dig into Lily's past, her attempts to falsify theft charges against her own niece. The board voted unanimously to remove her from the company. Lily stood beside Elliot at the press conference, her hands shaking, but her chin lifted high. "She's my daughter," Elliot said to the cameras, "and anyone who has a problem with that knows where to find me." The cameras flashed, headlines exploded, but Lily wasn't afraid. Because for the first time, someone stood beside her. Someone wasn't letting go. A new beginning. The next morning, Lily sat on the penthouse balcony, the sun rising over the skyline. The city looked different from up here. Not a threat, but a place full of possibilities. Elliot stepped beside her, coffee in hand. They sat in silence for a long time before Lily spoke. "Do you really think I can do this?" she asked softly. "I know you can," Elliot said. Lily turned to him. "Thanks, Dad." Elliot's breath caught, but his smile was warm. "Anytime, kid." The city stretched out before them, 1,000 stories waiting to be written. And for the first time, Lily believed one of them could be hers.